Hey all, just a quick heads up before we get started. This episode was recorded this past summer, when unfortunately there was a big spike in reported hate crimes against Asian people. With that on our minds, Vanessa and I wanted to touch on Asian representation in media and MASH. But unfortunately, with complete honesty, we don't think we fully captured what we wanted to say, and more than likely mishandled it. In the interest of full disclosure, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is edited to remove some parts where we felt we are really speaking out of turn. Hopefully it's pretty seamless, but I felt weird not addressing it. Additionally, we are including some links to resources by people much smarter and more qualified than us discussing Asian representation in media, as well as where you can contact the show to continue the conversation and help us improve. Thank you for listening. On with the show.
Welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Vanessa.
And I'm Ethan.
And welcome to the show.
Vanessa, how are you doing today? We're finally at episode 2. For a while, didn't seem like we'd get here, but now here we are. We're in it for the long haul.
Started from the bottom and now we're here.
Aw, yeah. I feel like we shouldn't be celebrating until like episode 5, but you know...
Let's try to get through let's try to get through season 1 first, and then we can celebrate.
You got to take the little victories. So this episode was interesting. Do you want to get into it, or is there anything that you want to bring up beforehand?
Let's just get into it. So in this episode, when the 407's allotment of vital medical supplies is stolen before it arrives, Hawkeye and Trapper try to get it back by making a deal on the black market.
I really liked this episode. It was pretty fun. I like how we're kind of continuing them being like a little bit rebellious, but also all of their goals so far are like very noble. I like how that is a continuing thing for the series so far. Vanessa, what did you think about it?
I thought it was, since it's been kind of a while since I watched season 1 of the show, like the very first episodes of season 1 of the show, it really struck me that they were trying to establish Hawkeye and Trapper as these goofs that were also good guys. They were bad, like we said in last week's episode, they were bad guys, but also they're good guys. And I think that that's really funny that they kind of continued with that into episode 2 of the show. And obviously it continues throughout the entire series, but the next episode they established like, whoa, well, this is we're doing this again. So I thought that was interesting. So what I really liked is that they were establishing Henry more as this really goofy CO. Like, he's just a bad commanding officer. I love Henry's character. He's just one of my favorite people in charge who just kind of shouldn't be in charge throughout all of any TV that I've ever seen. I love it. So in this episode, when they find out that the medical supplies has been stolen from black marketeers, Hawkeye and Trapper go into Henry and he says, well, what am I supposed to do about it? It's like, you're the commanding officer. What do you think you're supposed to do about it? It was just so funny.
Yeah, how they handled it with how the drugs were stolen and how, like, the military isn't doing anything for them because it just doesn't fit in their, like, bureaucracy at that moment. It does continue the kind of anti-war, anti-military stance that the show kind of takes without it being, like, overbearing. It's just the military in that moment isn't run well and doesn't kind of treat their doctors very well. Another thing that I really like about this episode, and what I find particularly impressive about it, is that everybody has such, like, established chemistry with each other already. Like, they feel like they've been here for a long time. And for a lot of shows, like episode 2, you're not gonna get that kind of vibe yet. Like, a lot of it takes time to kind of establish everything, but this feels more like ready to go than a lot of shows that even come out today.
That's so funny that you say that, because when I was watching it, I actually felt almost the opposite, particularly in the part with Frank and Margaret, where they are kind of like canoodling a little bit. So in the episode when Hawkeye and Trapper are going to trying to steal Henry's desk to trade to the black marketeers for the vital medical supplies that they were missing. Frank and Margaret happen upon them, and there's this one scene where they're very much like kind of like flirting and stuff like that. And in the previous episode, it was kind of established that they had something going on, but in this episode, in this scene, I felt like it seemed very new to me. And that was kind of an indication that this relationship might have been new because, you know, they haven't been there for that long. And especially since it's 1950, you know, I kind of got the sense that they have been there for a while, but also not that long. Maybe that the war had kind of just started, or that, you know, they had just been transferred in or something like that. I think that's interesting that you felt kind of the almost exact opposite.
I can't really speak to Margaret and Burns's relationship as much because you've seen more of the show. You kind of know where it goes, where these characters go more than I do. But just on an actor chemistry level, they feel like they're in those roles for a long time and they kind of know who they're playing. And I'm sure that they evolve over time. I'm sure that they like change and everyone is vastly different towards the end of the show. But watching these first two episodes, I didn't notice like any major kind of rustiness with them. It felt like very natural, like they all kind of these characters knew each other.
Yeah, I'd say so. I would agree with that as well. I think just from me kind of knowing the show and watching it out of order at times when I'm watching syndicated episodes on, you know, just TV when it's on, seeing it chronologically is very different than watching it and knowing the characters and knowing the show so well. I think that's really interesting.
Like Radar, I love how they're establishing Radar because it's been a while since I watched it, and in my head Radar is more of like a lapdog character, kind of like passive and not very like counterproductive of what Henry wants and everything. But in these first two episodes, he's like pretty rebellious. Like he'll side with Hawkeye and Trapper and like go along with their schemes and like help them out. And like in my head, Radar is such like an innocent guy that I think it's very interesting that he's kind of going above his superior so often, to granted doing like good things, but yeah, it's a fun part of his character that he is kind of a rapscallion as well, if I may use that word again.
That's so funny because I actually noted down in my notes when I was watching the episode, I said Radar is such a G because he is always, this is kind of first establishing that he is, you know, on Hawkeye and Trapper's side. He is very much, he tries to do what's not going to get him in trouble and what's right, but he also kind of knows that what Hawkeye and Trapper do isn't necessarily the way the army would want it done, isn't following the rules, but it's still the right thing. What's funny about Radar's character in this episode too, and in the first episode as well, is that they establish his character quirks pretty much like head on, like his radar sense where he gets his nickname. And even in this, he's shoveling down food from the mess tent, and that's a joke throughout the show that like the food is really bad, but also that Radar just like eats the food as if he's not even tasting it, that it's like this, he has this affinity for the army food that's so bad, but he just continues to eat it and eat it and eat it. And that's something that's central to the character throughout the entirety of him being on the show. And I thought that that was really funny that, you know, sometimes those small character quirks, they dissipate throughout the show. They're like written out. And in this sense, it's not, the characters do change, but there are aspects of them that are central to the character that are very consistent. And I think that that's really funny.
That one very quick line from Hawkeye while Radar's eating, and he's like, oh, well, when I come back, I'll pump your stomach for you. And Radar just kind of looks at him and he's like, what do you mean? I don't understand. That's one of my probably favorite lines from this episode. Just the way that the reaction was, I thought was very funny. So kind of getting more into the meat of this, after they can't get medical supplies the right way, they decide to go to the black market to get basically what was stolen from them. And I personally really liked this kind of place and this character that they meet. It's very different than maybe what you would expect it to be, because it's a very like chill kind of place that they go to. The black market's like a very relaxed environment, and even the guy that they meet, Charlie, is like just a chill guy, and he's like, when he's talking, like, oh, don't worry, our employees have a medical plan and retirement benefits. And I don't know, I was just not expecting that kind of joke of like, yeah, they're chill guys in the black market. I just thought it was funny.
I think that's really funny too, because it's like, you know, in like war-torn Korea, people, like the Korean government wasn't treating its citizens well, but then the black market, it's kind of showing how how badly the Korean people had it, of like the black market is treating them better than their government at this time. And it's just, it's kind of, I feel like it's a little bit of a callback to saying, you know, remember we're at war, you know what I mean?
And what did you think of Charlie? Because personally, like, I liked this character. I liked how relaxed he was and how casual, how he spoke with them. But I know you have a bit more thoughts of how everything is handled. So I'm curious of, your general thoughts.
So I like the character too. I thought it was really funny that with this character, he's supposed to be a Korean man, like native to Korea, and he has this very obvious American accent, like this kind of New Yorkish accent, which I found that to be really funny. And on third or fourth rewatch, honestly, of this show, there are a lot of Asian American actors in the show. And I don't know, and I'm sure we'll find out, but I don't know how many of them are actually Korean, because the actor who plays Charlie, his name was Jack Soo. And he is actually a Japanese American actor. So later on in the show, he meets Henry to check out the desk that they're trying to barter for medicine with this character. And he puts on more of a Korean accent when he's talking to Henry to try to play off as if he's more Korean, I guess, than he is. I really, that was kind of weird.
I took it as like less familiar with the American ways.
Yeah.
I don't know, not to sound weird, but he was trying to come off as more ignorant, I think, by acting like he wasn't familiar with the American culture.
Which is so strange, because it's like he was supposed to be a general. So I don't really, like, that's strange to me. But even so, strange. I guess it was just to,
but I think the performance really saves it. I think there's a lot of, like, energy from Jack Soo in this, where he just has like a really fun vibe, and I think that is largely from the performance rather than kind of what they're actually doing with him on the page.
Yeah, and Jack Soo, I did some research on the actor Jack Soo as well, and he was basically like a born performer. He was most well known for his role in another sitcom, The Barney Miller Show, which I actually have not seen. One of the few old sitcoms I haven't seen. He's, as I said, he's a Japanese American. So during World War II, he was relocated to a Japanese internment camp, specifically the Topaz War Relocation Center in Utah, which apparently is like the most well-known internment camp for Japanese American citizens during that time. And he was called the camp favorite because he was performing the entire time he was there. He was doing dancing and singing and stuff like that. And he eventually made it onto Broadway after after World War II was over, which I thought was just so crazy.
That's very interesting.
I don't think they could have had a better actor to play this kooky kind of crazy guy, this black marketeer, than Jack Soo. And I think that's so cool.
That's very interesting. Like, obviously Japanese internment camps are like very, very, very bad, but it is interesting when you hear people who lived it kind of go on to have it's seemingly a very interesting, very like good career for that time period.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like we've said, his performance kind of makes this character and makes this episode. There are other things that I like a lot about this episode episode as well. I like the general story. I like how it escalates, how they try to steal the desk from Henry's office at night, but then they get stuck in the room. I like how everything kind of becomes dire, like a little bit, because it is funny, but they're also trying to get this thing that they need from the situation. And the ending, when they knock the wall down and send the desk off in a helicopter, I thought was like incredible.
Watching this episode again reminds me so much of how this was a lot more of the sitcom era of this show specifically. So because the show ran for so long, there was definitely a tonal shift eventually. In the first few seasons, the earlier seasons, for sure, it had more of a sitcom funny vibe. And this was very much like very sitcom, like very 1970s sitcom of this show for this episode, and I like that. There's something nostalgic about it that I really like. Dramatic, hard-hitting show that's coming back and still being a sitcom. I really like it.
As someone less familiar with the 70s sitcom as you are, I like this kind of hijink where they're in a situation and the situation gets worse, like it constantly builds off itself, and then the resolution is like insane. Like just the shots that they actually get of them watching the helicopter fly off and just how mystified Henry is like watching it happen, I thought was genuinely very funny.
Yeah, and again, having watched all the show and knowing the older episodes as well, it's really funny that was so quintessential MASH to me, that desk flying off into, them selling off the desk and the shot of it flying off into the distance. That was so something that was like, well, that's definitely MASH.
Do we have any other thoughts we want to address before kind of wrapping up?
I don't really want to end on a negative-ish note, but I tried to get to this before. So as I said, that rewatching this show again from the beginning, you kind of see the time period a little bit, where we said Jack Soo is a Japanese American actor, and this is set in Korea. Obviously, it's about the Korean War, and the joke at the end, which I thought was obviously, it's a little bit of a racist joke where Henry says to Charlie's character at the end, "Don't you have a cousin?"
We should mention that, just to explain this a bit, Charlie posed as a general to inspect Henry's desk earlier in the episode. And then Charlie shows up again to drop off the medical supplies after the desk kind of gets into his possession. So Henry kind of sees Charlie in this moment, and Charlie's like head ducking and trying to avoid eye contact with him. And Henry says like, "Oh, are you related to that general that I met with earlier?" And then Charlie responds like, "Oh, well, you know what they say, we all look alike," like kind of making fun of racism.
Yeah, I don't think that it would fly today, regardless. But that brought up for me an aspect of the show that watching it in the 21st century and being a little bit more aware. I have been noticing when I rewatch episodes of MASH that, there are Asian actors and not all of them are Korean, even though they're supposed to be Korean. And I think that I don't think the show is like that self-aware to be making this joke of like, oh, look, we're using this Asian actor because these white people don't understand that, we can use Asian, like that not all Asian people look the same. I'm curious as we continue to watch it and as we do a little bit more research about the show, how many actually like Korean actors were featured in the show, certainly like later on as well. You can definitely see there are actors that are reused a lot to play different characters. I'm excited to see the change, hopefully, in that as the show goes on, that they actually use Korean actors a little bit more. I should say as well that joke that, oh, well, you know what we said, we all look the same. That's actually brought up in a more negative way throughout the show a little bit more throughout, like, in future episodes. And it's kind of rebuked, as well. It's used as like a negative thing, and it almost immediately like, hey, that's not right. So I wouldn't say the show's racist, but like they do utilize some like racist jokes sometimes.
It's one of those things, and we talked about this last episode as well, but it's difficult to look at something like this, like outside of its own context. I imagine having a TV show at this time in the 1970s with so many prominent Asian characters and like guest roles and everything. I imagine that was kind of groundbreaking and kind of progressive, but having look back on today and how they handled the production, the jokes they wrote for these actors, it's one of those things where it's like, it is a step forward, but also not necessarily where we want to be today. And, you know, it's something we have to acknowledge that this show is nearly 50 years old. It's a difficult line to walk, and I'm sure it's something we will keep addressing as the show goes on.
What's so funny about this as well, I just looked it up. Margaret Cho actually said about this show. Margaret Cho is a Korean American stand-up comedian, and she said, she was like, well, you know, there's never any like Korean people on TV. Like there's no Korean representation except like maybe sometimes in MASH. So I just like one of her stand-up that just reminded me of this. So yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if we'll need to have a recurring segment in our show being like, this is the racist bit of the episode, but it is something we should kind of keep addressing, you know, acknowledge that it's there and not try to condemn it for being of its time. Because that's not a good way to look at art. You can't look at art and be like, oh, well, this doesn't hold up with my modern standards of how we want things to be. You kind of do have to look at it with the lens of this is what it's trying to be.
Like I said with last episode, like we would be remiss not to mention it when there's like overtly racist things. But as I said, I had said to you, I don't know if I ever said it on the podcast, but I was saying to you, in the show, they do deal with racism. And it kind of, it's always seen as like a bad thing, a negative thing, like real racism. Like there's storylines that deal with it. And it's never like, oh yeah, this is right. It's always rebuked as this is the wrong. This person is bad for saying these things or doing these things or engaging this way. In fact, we'll be getting into that a little bit more in the coming episodes because there is some real stuff that goes on in the next few episodes. So...
Ooh, I'm excited. I don't know what you're talking about. No, it's very exciting. So to kind of get us out of this territory, do you have any particular favorites from this episode? Any favorite line? Any favorite like character interaction before we wrap up?
I just gotta say one more time, like shout out to Henry for being like the worst commanding officer ever, right? Like
Henry's so delightful though.
He is. I love him.
I love him in his fishing hat. It's so funny looking.
He is really, like we said, he is the epitome of really not wanting to be there, but kind of having to be there. Even more so than I feel like Hawkeye and Trapper are. He's just so not cut out for it. And he's a lieutenant colonel. So it's really interesting. I just love Henry's character.
There was two really good bits where Henry is like, oh, well, I'm a doctor too, you know, and he points to his diploma on the wall.
Yeah.
And Trapper, I think, is like, oh, that's your high school diploma. Like, of course he has a medical degree. But it's just funny that he chose to hang up his high school diploma on the wall rather than his degree. Also, the bit where they bring Charlie in to look at the desk and Hawkeye is like, oh, this desk is big, Henry. How did you get it into such a small room? And then Henry is just like, oh, well, you take the top off of it. And then Hawkeye and Trapper like look at each other and be like, oh, you take the top off. Like, they didn't, like, implying that they tried to just steal the desk earlier, I thought was like a good joke that we didn't, like, filled in with your imagination that they were trying to get it through the door and they're like, oh, we can't do it. So now we have to devise a whole scheme to have this general look at it instead.
Yeah, this episode was really fun. I liked this episode a lot.
Good episode. I think it's a good episode too. Just again, very surprised with how well established everything already feels and how much energy there is. I'm like, yeah, some stuff doesn't hold up, but it is a good show to kind of look back on and be like, wow, this is a very unique for its era.
So with that, we've concluded our second episode of MASHmouth. We'd just like to give some thanks to Jacob Furibalco for being our technical consultant, Melissa, my sister, for cover art, and of course, our listeners. As of the recording of this podcast, we still don't have our music, but it will be linked in the description by the time it comes up. You can follow us on social media at Valiantly Off Balance. You can follow Ethan on Instagram at Ethan Was Cool, and you can follow me, Vanessa, at Unvanessary. And until next time, take the top of your desk off before trying to get it through the door. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everybody.